Testing, testing, testing. Oh, okay, cool. What is going on? Good morning, good Friday. What's going on, Fallen? What is going on? This is a lot earlier than I'm used to doing, but we're gonna be in for a good one. We're gonna be talking about Daggerheart today. Just making sure I have stuff set up on my end. All right, so yeah, welcome to today's stream. We're gonna be talking about Daggerheart today. So, Critical Role's fantasy TTRPG has been one of the most anticipated games to be announced from the fallout of the Dark Times. From It's one of many fantasy TTRPGs to be announced right after the OGL debacle happened. Like everyone else and their mom, I play tested Daggerheart with my buddies, and now that the game is in open beta, and I have some feelings about this game. The game has been promoted to some extent by Critical Role and Darrington Press, but also there's an assumption on social media regarding this system being a rules light system, and I have to say Daggerheart is not a rules light system. So for this entire stream, it's going to be a bit of a short one. I don't plan on doing a complete deep dive into the system because the playtest rules for at least the first version of the open beta is 400 pages. And that sounds about as much fun as getting hit by a pillowcase full of bricks. So yeah, we're just not going to get deep dive into the nitty gritty. We're just going to do a nice broad overview of what my experience playing Daggerheart is, and also just go over why the system isn't rules light like people are making out to be, and also whether this game is the D&D killer the industry and community seems to be obsessed with finding. Because there's just this obsession with finding the D&D killer, even more so after the OGL. But yeah, it just seems people want to dethrone D&D, but don't really know the repercussions of what that would actually entail. So I'm gonna just jump into my first impressions. First and foremost, my play group had a blast playing the game. My buddies really picked up the mechanics of their characters quickly, and a lot of this has to do with it being very familiar to 5e. Uh, the speed at which they were able to grasp everything has a lot to do with its familiarity to 5e, but also the player options being very streamlined in comparison. So it plays with a lot of the player options play with the similar themes of what character options you find in 5e, but also they strip away a lot of some of the mechanical nuance and leave the strong basis and a very, very streamlined design of their traits. Makes it very, very fluid, much easier to grasp and just really jump into it. In regards to character creation, it was actually a breeze because we avoided killing trees. And I was not going to print out all the cards in the playtest material that you can find online. Instead, we used Demiplane to create the characters. Demiplane made it really easy to just jump into the game, and it does an amazing job of just simplifying character creation. You don't have to have any of the cards. You're not shuffling through 400 pages to find every player option, to go through every weapon option you have available and figure out which one actually applies to your class. None of that. Everything is just made simple and put into place. You go to a step-by-step process. If you're familiar with D&D Beyond, Demiplane is made up of ex D&D Beyond developers. Those that have been let go by Wizards, or those that had left prior when they sold off D&D Beyond to Wizards, are now working on Demiplane. So it's going to be very, very familiar. It's very, very similar in its setup. If you're wanting to play Daggerheart as a player, don't want to print out all the material, you want something to kind of ease you through it, Demiplane's character creator is probably the best bet. And honestly, it's a big boon to get into the game compared to other systems if you're trying to jump into it. Unless you're already working in a VTT environment where it has a character creator. If you're a play group that uses D&D Beyond at the table, Demiplane is going to be the best option for you for anything outside of D&D. Also, hashtag not sponsored, but yeah, Demiplane made it a lot easier just to have my play group build their characters. But I was in the game master chair for this game, and I ran the starter adventure. Prep felt pretty straightforward. The starting adventure did a decent job of walking me through the basics of the game. It provides a GM directions to go over the bread and butter rules with players, as well as guiding you through world building prompts to throw back at your players so that you can incorporate into the narration of the session. All of these things really help set the narrative focused tone of Daggerheart. The the best way I can describe the gameplay is that it feels flowy. There is a lot of back and forth between the players and the GM to keep the story moving. So the focus is always going to be on the story that you create with your players. If any of you are familiar with Critical Role, that is very much the direction this game wants to play in, a very narrative focused direction. It is different from stuff like Pathfinder Second Edition and even bits and pieces of 5e where there is that tactical wargaminess where that is the center focus of the game you're playing. Daggerheart in a way, it is the feeling of the flowiness isn't that it doesn't allow you to be tactical. It just wants you to use combat as another piece to help you tell a story. What helped reinforce this kind of narrative story time is the backbone of the system, which is the duality die. It is a 2d10, I want to say, yeah, 2d10 system. Is it d10 or d12? Let me see. Yeah, I'm going to make sure. Duality die. Daggerheart. 2d12. Okay, yeah, it's a 2d12 system with one of those 12-sided die representing hope and the other one representing fear. What I found fun as a DM is that I have a little bit more control on how to spin the narrative based off of whether hope or fear was rolled on certain rolls. It was very reminiscent of Cypher Systems' GM intrusion mechanic, where a GM can impose an intrusion and alter the result in a way that help push the story. Well, I believe, like, from my experience of just playing on the player side of of Cypher System, GM intrusions are there is a limit. This hope and fear mechanic for Daggerheart is very much on. The only issue I would see come up that Daring to Press really needs to figure out in how to help guide game masters in regards to fear die. There was a set time in our play that my players rolled a string of just fear, but there's only so much. There's a limit within the narrative that allowed me to put detriments where they just won't matter anymore. You- so if they just keep rolling with fear and there isn't really anything you can do to push that the negativity without actually just like literally hindering them and hurting the story. That's where think when you just have those string of bad dies, that's where I feel the fear and hope mechanic can actually buckle a bit, since it is entirely dependent on the GM to determine the outcome of that. They arbitrate that outcome. And that's the only time I see it rolling a fear and a bunch of fear back to back to back could be an issue because there's only so many things you can actually do to be a detriment to your players that actually fit within the time and place of that story that you guys are telling. While the back and forth gameplay during social counters was no different from how it feels in 5th edition, when moving to combat, I felt the weight of this flowy style feel heavier on me as a DM. A large part of that is because Daggerheart lacks a traditional initiative. Since there is no real structure to how combat runs, it was up to me to control the flow of combat, also to ensure that every player could do something while also deciding when enemies could act or needed to make a rule clarification if there was some confusion. This is something I can see being a huge turnoff for GMs and players who need a little bit more structure during combat to help them, really just to help manage the table, or for a player to make sure that they are able to take their turn if they tend to be a shy or quiet person. It's, for my play group, it's not a point of contention, but if you're playing with a bunch of random people, you're not playing with a consistent play group who hasn't really found their dynamic and their social rules. They're pretty much the social rules of engagement. They haven't your play group hasn't it's a bunch of brand new people and you haven't really developed your social contract, as the Magic the Gathering Commanders players like to say. That could be an issue. There is the potential for um, spotlight hogging, either a player just being overwhelming and just doing a bunch of stuff, or the DM also just being overwhelming and doing a bunch of stuff because there is no actual structure to it. I think the biggest thing is like Daggerheart really makes the assumption that a group of players are going to be adults and kind of have a self-respect for each other and be able to just behave and have fun, which is I don't mind that. I don't think a game should have rules or ways to kind of just dictate how an adult should behave when they're playing the game. But I do think there should be a little bit more guidance to help GMs and players, pretty much play groups, kind of have a better understanding of how combat flows. The way it's written in the playtest material, at least in the first version of the playtest material, it's very much, well, if you want to. It's very very passive voice, and it's a little frustrating. So what I did to ensure that my play group and the enemies all got to act was at any time they rolled with fear in combat, I made sure that the enemies that they were attacking at least made a counterattack, or they were able to make a move. And if I felt any point in the story where it made sense that if they did some big play, and if there was any sort of, not sort of counter, but it made sense for the enemies to react to it, I would cash in fear tokens and action points to ensure that all my enemies start to react and move at the same time. I heavily relied on the token economy that builds up whenever players take an action or whenever they roll fear to really engage in combat to at least have a structure. But my DM style is very much more narrative pro player driven. I always try to allow my players to go. And my players were communicative enough and respectful enough to allow everybody to get a turn, and it allowed them to really discuss what they wanted to do, since we didn't have this like this initiative structure. If they wanted to do a team up move, they discussed it, boom. Then they described how the team up move happened. If they wanted to allow somebody else to go, they would set something up with their character that allowed the other person to actually move. Um, Anytime I saw any one of my players who tend to be a little bit more quiet and not really act, I made sure after one of the players did something, I moved on to them to ask what they wanted to do, how they wanted to contribute to the scene. Again, it's very weighted on the DM to manage that. It's not going to be everybody's play style. It is something. It is something that is talked about a lot in Game Master, Dungeon Master tips on YouTube, on social media, on your Reddit forums on how to actually have player engagement and ensure everybody goes. Everybody has their turn. Everybody does engages with the game. But compared to 5e has the initiative system. You have that baseline structured rules to help organize, specifically in combat, to help you guide and ensure you can have something to fall back on. And while these GM DM tips really matter more for outside of combat, it's taking that outside of combat feeling of making sure the DM kind of allows players to act and react and do things that are not in combat, and now bringing that whole dynamic into combat also without an initiative system. My players, their feedback was it was very freeing. They got to do things that weren't limited by the actual combat system. And they're like, my character wants to do this. Can I do this? And then they just did the thing, which is very, very freeing. Especially coming off of playing 5e and then trying Pathfinder Second Edition prior. It just didn't flow with my play group, who has drifted more towards narrative style gameplay. All right. And I mentioned tokens. So let me jump into whether the tokens are an issue. Uh, Honestly, they're not really hard to track. Uh, and it's very, I find it laughable that these tokens and the cards somehow make Daggerheart a board game. I think it's really ridiculous. The purpose of the tokens, and by extension the cards, and there are also mechanics that use dice to track them as like countdowns, is ways for you to handle things at the table that a virtual tabletop or digital character sheet would be able to handle. You get to do all those things, but in meat space. You get to do that in person, and it's very, very easy. Like it wasn't hard. It made a lot of sense. And the thing is, the way how freeing Daggerheart kind of is, you don't have to use everything if you can keep track of it. Um, it- but my biggest issue with saying that Daggerheart is a board game because of all these pieces, just because D&D and other TTRPGs don't include these tools in the game, doesn't mean you weren't buying stuff for your table and aren't funding Kickstarters or buying tools off websites to help keep track of the things that Daggerheart already has built into the game. Like, people are buying initiative sheets, dry race initiative sheets. They're buying special countdowns, initiative trackers, etc. Like, they're just buying all these tools to help keep track of everything that's going on. So Daggerheart just incorporates that into the game already. So whenever they release this starter set and guarantee they're going to release pretty much tools and stuff at game stores. They already have that built into the game, and it is incorporated into the game. That it just makes sense to have it there. And even then, the systems and stuff are not so hard to, or the tokens and stuff are not so hard to not track. That if you're just used to tracking things on paper, you can just do that. It's not, you don't need the actual physical tokens either. My playgroup didn't have any physical cards. I didn't use any. I didn't use any tokens because obviously I printed. I wasn't one of the cool ones that got the play kit, the press play kit, but I just put dice on a card and had one dice represent fear and just take up whenever they roll the fear, and then I had the action token die that just gave me actions, and I would just spin them up, roll them down, depending on what was going on. Really, really simple. There's a lot of ways to kind of go about it. In general, I just feel this criticism of Daggerheart being a board game very much a nothing burger of a argument. It's just a way to kind of like attack Critical Role because people don't like Critical Role in a lot of ways. Like, it's just another way to do it. In general, though, I was very much surprised at how much I enjoyed running this system and and especially how much fun my group liked playing the system. But I did leave the session feeling a little empty, like a little unsatisfied. It really felt like I went out to a fancy dinner. I ate the food, but then I still left the restaurant hungry. Um, and a lot of this just has to do with me wanting a bit more direction or guidance to run combat. The lack of initiative and that feeling of everything in motion, I really enjoyed it. But not having a strong sense of control or rules to fall back on puts more of the decision back on ge- like the game master. I would really like if they had a little bit stronger guidelines, something that's not written in passive voice, something that players can really fall back on and be like, hey, even if it's just useful, if you're struggling to run combat, here are some useful tips, and this is what we do, sort of guidelines that help people fall back on, and so they kind of get the flow of the game. Um, as of now, in the early playtest open beta version of Daggerheart, combat is just for the most part running off vibes. That's it. It's all vibes, which is fine. But yeah, it's just the game master gets to decide when stuff happens. So not going to be up to not really going to be up everybody's alley, but it is what it is. All right. So now we're going to get to whether Daggerheart is considered a rules light system. Um, by no means does the flowy feeling mean that this game is without actual rules. Um, many are claiming that Daggerheart is a rules light system, and I'm going to tell you they're wrong about that. Um, Daggerheart isn't rules light by any means. So there's two major systems that really expose where a lot of the crunch is for this game. First up, it's the character creation. It's just as involved as fifth edition's character creation. There's classes, there's subclasses, there's ancestries and communities, with the latter two being Daggerheart's version of species and backgrounds, respectively. Each class has two domains, which are two pools of card pools. Excuse me. Each domain are two card pools, which you choose your abilities from as you level and progress. It is very similar to Pathfinder's second edition's feat system. At various levels, you choose from each pool that allow you to further customize your character. You're not restricted by needing to pick from each pool of cards. Pretty much the pool of cards, both of them represent just options you can choose. And if you just want to pick options from a specific pool, you can mix and match. It is entirely up to you. There's even rules for multi-classing. So when you level, you can just incorporate one domain from one of the classes as that you choose when you multi-class. Subclasses function very similar to how 5e are. You get specific options at specific levels. It's not like the domain pool card pool system. Just you pick a specific club subclass, you get immediate options there, and then at later levels you get more options. There's only 10 levels of the game, so there's only two other times where your subclass grants you new stuff. So far, the subclasses seem pretty fine. They're they they're not as expansive and fantasy character defining like 5e currently. Each one right now in the playtest material come with two, and each of the ones that I've seen so far have only tapped into like certain fantasies of the base class that go off in different ways. So, for example, the warrior, which is the stand-in for your fighter, monk, and barbarian. What that one does, it has Call of the Brave and then the other one was more damage focused. So Call of the Brave just plays up the idea that you're a proud, strong, uh, fearless warrior, and then the other subclass is more about just doing damage. But none of them, by comparison to like if a 5e fighter, are really fantasy narrative driven where you get supernatural abilities. So that was like the big difference, and the same thing for the Seraph, which is the stand-in for the cleric and the paladin. The subclasses there just further branch off. Either you're pretty much a flying paladin, or you're a white mage. So that's pretty much where they go. There, I think as they develop more and then eventually release more subclasses, we might see that. But it's very interesting how the subclasses themselves are, at least the starter ones, are tying closer to core fantasies by but still being different. And a lot of that has to do with how character traits and stuff are really streamlined. Ancestry communities are also similar to 5e species and backgrounds. Like I said, they provide bonuses up front, but you don't upgrade them as you progress. Yeah, they're not upgradable as you level up. Just you're a goblin, you get your goblin trait, and then you're from a mage school, so you get your mage school trait, and that's pretty much it. It stops there. Uh, um, the big part of the reason the character options look and feel lighter compared to 5e is because the designs are streamlined. So each option you choose for your character isn't bloated with a bunch of text with a ton of different abilities that you'll probably forget to use, like in 5e. It is nothing like that. Um, all the options in Daggerheart are very clear, they're concise, and for the most part have a single function. It is 1 to 2 line of text that just tell you this is the thing you do and that's all you get. The only ones I've seen, like almost every class is like that. There's only either one option, 2 options max. I know the mages, the wizard, and sorcerer have pretty much 2 options in their kit, which they get some sort of cantrip like ability, and then they get another ability that's meant to be a bit more defining on how the class functions. While something like the guardian, which is your tank, your barbarian or paladin or fighter tank builds, or if compared to 5e, they have a single ability that pretty much functions like rage. It's damage mitigation. You do a little bit extra damage, and that's pretty much it. And then you have something like the ranger, who pretty much has Daggerheart's version of Hunter's Mark, and that's all they get for like the class feature. Like everything's very streamlined. Race options are very streamlined. They get 1 line of text that says this is, if you're playing this race, this is what they're good at. This is the thing that they do, and that's it. There's nothing like the biggest. You'll see the biggest difference is that when you look at races, species, ancestries in Daggerheart compared to 5e. Like 5e, there's just a ton of different things that I feel very much bloat species design. Daggerheart, a lot of stuff that 5e tries to define and has through time removed. Daggerheart just says you can make all that other stuff up, but if you're playing this specific race, this is kind of their, yeah. If you're playing this specific ancestry, this is kind of this is the option that defines them. This is the trait that defines them. I can't say all of those traits that each ancestry gets in Daggerheart are very like are defining in a way that make it feel natural or like a member of that species would have. Some of them just rely on typical fantasy depictions. Um, but and sometimes obviously some fantasy depictions of a specific species ancestry tend to be based more on a personality than it is on an actual biological thing. Daggerheart kind of does their best to not fall into it, but there's a couple of times where just you can kind of tell it's like, oh, they're going more for this kind of character option for this specific ancestry instead of making it some sort of biological thing that makes a lot more sense. Where you're kind of seeing that's the case in 5e to some extent, that they're going more biological traits or magical traits that are inherent. Um, so yeah, there's still just some fantasy isms still within the thing, and it's fine. It doesn't really detract from it. but it's just something as my design brain goes off. It's like, oh, okay, well they could have just tried to go a different route with it, but I still like Daggerheart's approach to ancestry species design because it's not bloated. It's just very streamlined. Um, so yeah, that's just character creation. The other system that is very much shows the crunch in Daggerheart. That it is probably the most mechanically driven part of the system is the threshold system. It is the defensive system that determines whether your character takes damage or not. So all characters have a total can take a total of 6 damage. There is no actual hit point pool. Yeah. Every character has 3 thresholds levels that are determined by a combination of your class and ability scores. When you take damage, you compare that damage to your threshold levels, and if they are within the range of those levels, you take damage determined by that level, which is always going to be 1, 2, or 3 damage. You can lower the damage using your armor score so that the damage dealt can be brought to a lower threshold level. This is pretty much where a lot of the meat of combat will be, and since characters' lives are limited, the threat of death is always present. There was a couple times in my group's playtest where I I did 3 damage and I took out half their available hit points in one swoop. Just so the tactics had to change. They really had to rethink of what they need to do. It was an interesting, very different dynamic compared to when we play 5e, where as long as we have somebody that has available healing and somebody goes down, we can yo-yo. Like you can get back up, keep on fighting. Um, this eh, the threshold system, I think, is going to be the more difficult thing to grasp, but it's actually really fun. It is probably the gamiest part of the game. It has the most crunch to it, but as soon as you get it, it's very straightforward. There are strong limitations around it since the threat of death is present. You have to determine how to manage those resources there. You only get 3 armor slots to use, and as soon as you use all those 3 armor slots, you pretty much you don't have any armor, so you can't defend against attacks anymore. So yeah, it's just very interesting to see how all that entails. It was a fun system, and it adds to the dramatics, the narrative of combat in a lot of good ways. Eh, Coming over from 5e, that was probably the part my group kind of struggled a little bit with, just figuring out how the threshold system works. But as soon as we got through like the second part of like the second combat, okay, it clicked, and they were just like, okay, cool, I take damage. Okay, we got to be careful. Um, the squishier member got hurt. Okay, the tankier character needs to just come bull rushing in and start taking hits for them. Like, it allows for that narrative decision making, and people get very much into how their character will play. Like they can get into the mindset of the character in combat, um, in a way that is more narrative driven compared to tactically gamey driven like 5e or Pathfinder Second Edition. It is very interesting. At least that's what I saw the light bulb flicker on a couple of my players who tend to be a little bit more tactical, more game driven, and then they started to switch to narrative driven because threshold system and in general the hope and fear die system reinforced how all the narrative was. Um, it doesn't seem as clunky as it sounds at times. But it works. Is the best way, the easiest way, more straightforward way. It's actually fun. Um, Other things that are also present that have rules. There are death rules, and there's also status conditions. There, the starting adventure doesn't go over any of those two things. None of the creatures in the and none of the monsters that you fight within the starter adventure actually inflict any status conditions. But I think kind of it's not that it's a bad thing, but it's something that they really do need to do in a starting adventure. I think the shining example, by comparison, is Pathfinder Second Edition, where they have you run through a dungeon for the starting adventure, and each room in that dungeon teaches the mechanics of the game, and it pretty much continues to escalate it, so the players get used to doing certain things. So first room is exploration, second room is exploration combat, and then the next room is traps, and then the third room is like exploration combat traps, and then just like learning how status conditions work, etc. Like it just continues to build as you explore that dungeon. I think for Daggerheart, well, the starting adventure was fine just to get you into the flow of combat, but to really comprehend, or not in flow combat, the starting adventure was fine to get you into the flow of how the game runs, but to really teach you how to play the game, Daggerheart does need another starting adventure that it is written from a procedural perspective to help guide the game master how to run the game, how to go through combat, how status conditions work, and if death is involved, these are the options there for you. It's like it's short. The starting adventure is just short of being really solid. It is almost there. But yeah, there's still more rules that are not explored in the starting adventure that are still integral. There's a ton of weapon options, even though the damage types are very pared down compared to 5e. There's only two damage types. It's magical and non-magical, and determine and pretty much depending. Oh yeah, it's physical and magical. That's what it is. But there's still a ton of weapon types, like different weapons that help determine the kind of fantasy you want your character to play. So you still have to push through all that information and how they interact with your character. So there's still rules that govern that. So again, Daggerheart isn't a rules light system by any means, but it is a lighter system by comparison to fifth edition, just because of how streamlined the design is for its character options and its combat resolution mechanics. Like it just streamlines it in a way that makes it feel lighter, feel not necessarily faster. Combat speed is going to be determined by DM arbitration and the back and forth between your players, but a lot of just that lightness, that flowiness, the heaviness and crunchiness that you get from fifth edition, and even more so in Pathfinder second edition, isn't there in Daggerheart, just because the options are just much more streamlined. But it doesn't mean that there isn't some level of crunch there. There isn't rules to help govern combat, at least damage and resolution stuff. There's still stuff there that they have to have rules on. So it's lighter by comparison, but it's not rules light. Um, Now this brings me to the last bit. The question everybody has been asking since it's been released. The open beta has been out for almost a month already, right? Is Daggerheart the D&D killer? And my answer is no. It is nowhere near being a D&D killer. Uh, Daggerheart's going to set itself apart by being narrative. Daggerheart's going to set itself apart by being a narrative focused fantasy TTRPG, and that style of game doesn't appeal to everybody. There is never going to be a D&D killer on the market because the community doesn't even enjoy the same aspects that make up the current version of 5e. Uh, each fantasy TTRPG that spawned out of the OGL debacle is a spinoff of a specific gameplay style that 5e's Kinship Seek system supports. So these new games are just going to be better at supporting those gameplay styles while disregarding other gameplay styles because they don't want to interact with those. Uh, Daggerheart is going to lean on the narrative style of play and be lighter on the wargaming tactical combat aspect that you find in 5e and you really see in Pathfinder second edition. Another reason why Daggerheart won't be a D&D killer is because it's not doing anything new compared to 5e. The player options feel like conversions to 5e the player options feel like conversions to 5e player options to fit within their system. The way we roll pretty much the dice we roll and the way we calculate damage may be a little different, but we're still doing similar things to 5e, just with a bit more storytelling focus. That's nothing I said is a knock to the system. Um, I think these are good things, and the reason being is that I think Daggerheart's place in the market will be to attract new players who were possibly intimidated by 5e's rule set, but really love Critical Role, or for players to try a TTRPG. This will be their first TTRPG they will try that isn't D&D. In its current state, Daggerheart seems to be a perfect gateway game for folks to start playing other games. The only thing I think that can hold this game back, and this is something it's in the future that I think will hold this game back, is the lack of third party support and independent designer support. Um, Third party player option design might be easier because the options are much more streamlined, but there's going to be a higher cost to produce these options due to the need for physical cards for artwork and layout work. Like it just you already have artwork and layout work be a problem for people that professionally want to jump into 5e and design there, but you're going to be doing that on a PDF. For Daggerheart, on the other hand, you need to do this on cards, and then you need to be able to have those cards available to print. So that's one of those things. Like, okay, that is a barrier to entry there. Um, Another thing that's going to hold them back is that while you're going to have campaign and stories to be able, like, you'll have access to those since there's a ton of system agnostic books that cover those things. But when it comes to monsters, Daggerheart's monster design is pretty much its own closed system, and system agnostic books, their monsters are not going to be able to translate into Daggerheart compared to OSR and any other like any other system that allows for a system agnostic monster design to actually be usable in their game. So that stuff's not going to be easy to convert. They're going to have to create a guide to help people convert those monsters into it. Those are the two big things that I think will hurt it in a way, unless they have plans to just pump out as much material for it so that they themselves are flooding the market with their own content that will be supporting that game. Overall, the game is fun. My play group is itching to play again. I want to sit on the player side this time. There's me and one other of my buddies who have yet to be a player. So we're seeing if one of our other DMs who normally just runs 5e will pick up and learn the system on the game master side and run it for us. Uh, I don't think this is a system for my play group that will replace 5e as like our core game. Um, but its narrative focus is very much in line with how my group plays. So that is a lot of the big appeal. What makes my my play group excited to play this? Like it was. We've tried a couple other games and we're just like, okay, we like aspects of them, but this was the first one I saw that the light bulb clicked and everything was like, oh, this is fun. Like we enjoy doing this. Okay, we're gonna try to. They were actually willing to try certain things that they felt 5e as a system didn't allow them to try, or they would get punished for trying because the system doesn't. The system is written in a way that doesn't allow them to do certain things. Daggerheart allowed them to do cool stuff because it just made a lot of sense with the character and the narrative we were trying to tell. Um, I still think it's too early to make a final judgment since the game is an open beta, but I am very hopeful for the future of Daggerheart. It has it's doing a lot of cool things and opening a style of play and supporting a style of play that 5e at times struggles to do, and I don't see that in other systems because of how gamified they are. So from a year from now, I'm down to take another look at the game and see where they're at when it's finally released and see what changed or what became of it. Because yeah, the Daggerheart's fun. I enjoyed it. It's a really solid system. Solid system so far. There's just some uh, things that I think need to get really worked out. Just really help guide DMs that are not that do rely on amount of rules to help maintain control and structure. I think having not necessarily more rules for that, but a little bit more ways to guide DMs on different techniques and stuff will be the best thing possible for them. DBZ Daggerheart was a great sesh. I got to play a class type that was new to me. I had no issue with the dice system or cards. I like +2 or +1 for experience that can be applied situationally. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of little things that that I liked. The card system in general is a fun system. I kind of wish they did more with it, to be honest. The only class I saw that did anything with the card system was the sorcerer because they were actually able to ditch an active card that they have ready and to either gain a temporary power or something. Excuse me. I know that there are rules to be able to swap cards on the fly. So if you have pretty much one in your deck that's on hold, um, you can spend some sort of resources to swap one option for a current active option you have. So the way the card system works, each character pretty much has a set amount of options that they can have active, like as if it's their hand. And these are these are always options that you have available to you. It isn't like you use it once and it's done unless it states otherwise. But at any point where the options you have available aren't the one you need at that moment, and you have something in your deck, you're and pretty much not equipped, there you can swap them out for, I believe it's stress, the stress system. So yeah, it's it's interesting. I wish they kind of did more with it. If now Daggerheart's giving me ideas of like, man, a TTRPG game that's played entirely by a deck of cards would be pretty sick. But that's just because I've played Magic the Gatherings for so long that that kind of appeals to me. I know that would appeal to my play group. I know that won't appeal to everybody though. Oh yeah, yeah. Daggerheart is fun. I recommend people trying it out. It's a very interesting system. Excuse me. But yeah, it's just I just want more guidance out of the system. But it's fun. It is a fun system. Fun if you're wanting that narrative style of play. If you're wanting a more war gamey system, a lot more crunch than what 5e offers you. There's Pathfinder Second Edition. There's also MCDM RPG that's coming out soon, or that's in open testing also, that are catering to that style of tactical play. 5e's kitchen sink method isn't going to be for everybody simply because people want a little bit more of certain gameplay styles. But the fact that it is kitchen sink and it's customizable allows it to be molded to fit people's play styles. I think by comparison, Daggerheart being so narrative focused, but also not having concrete rules for a lot of stuff, opens it up to be somewhat modifiable as long as you can design and interact with it on a system level. But yeah, that's all I have to say about Daggerheart. I probably will talk about more. I will probably talk more about Daggerheart the more I actually get to actively play it. Um, in terms of like, excuse me, keep burping. In terms of player options and and creating builds and stuff, since the game is much more narrative focused, there isn't really ways to min max, which I actually enjoy because that means you can make characters that are more character driven. Um, I just want to see more of the game after it's been released to really see how development goes because maybe I will release some stuff for it too, but it just really depends on, how accessible they make third party and independent designer support for that game. Like that's really all it comes down to. But yeah, that pretty much about does it for this stream. I just wanted to jump in and talk about Daggerheart really quick. I will be I will be trying to stream another time this month, hopefully, so that we can look at more Scourge design. That is always the goal. My goal is to get the Scourge class for 5th edition out this summer. So I'm getting some more of the some more art commissioned. I'm trying to decide if I'm going to do 2 or 3 pieces. If you've been in the Degenerates Pack Discord, I've talked about what those pieces are going to be. I think I settled on the species options for each one to be like the iconic representation of each subclass for there. All that's really left right now, I've been doing testing. Community member and fellow designer, Drunken Yoda Daryl Dominguez has ran a playtest for me and a couple other designers to test out what player options they're trying to push out for 5e. And I've also been play testing the class myself at my home game, playing a bunch of like we are a play group of rats. And then we're helping a wizard out in exchange for a big wheel of cheese. We're we're going to drive a demon that he shrunk that is under his bed. So I've been playtesting the Soul Broker subclass in that game, and then for the designer game, the designer playtest game, I just did the bread and butter Black Order vanilla option. But yeah, part of the issue is just really trying to get mechanics that are fun, evocative, but also work. And what I'm finding out in a lot of the playtests is that on paper the ideas sound really, really solid, but in play they don't. They're missing some component so that they are active. So Soul Broker has pretty much been fixed. It is outside of a capstone subclass option. It's pretty much done. A Black Order needed to get some rework because all the available options for its core mechanic worked on multiple enemies, but if you're only fighting a single target, it does absolutely nothing. Another issue we had it. I know I went on a 48-hour crisis on trying to fix the DC for the Strike Fear mechanic, the bread and butter mechanic for the Scourge, because I realized that multi-classing and certain racial options would affect the damage base, like the concentration check, like influenced DC. So the original DC we had for it was never whenever you hit an enemy and you wanted to pretty much apply fear to them, the DC would be 10 plus half the damage dealt by your Scourge weapon. But say you multi-class into Barbarian, you multi-class into Paladin, you multi-class into Warlock and take Hex, or you're a Goblin and use Fury the Small, you completely gunk up the DC for that and make it too strong. So um, now we're just gonna use a flat DC. I saw counsel. Um, I talked to Taryn, Indestructible, good old buddy, to give me a reality check, and yeah, he just said go with the flat DC. It makes a lot of sense. It's a D&D truism. So yeah, so we're just going with that one. Yeah, we're gonna just stick with that. But yeah, we're gonna have that, and then as soon as Scourge is done, we're jumping into Puppeteer because that class is actually almost done too. I have the modular system kind of like on paper now. I just need to actually flesh out every option. But the modular system, since it is a pact caster, it's gonna allow you to customize your puppet. Allow you to customize your puppet to have it act like a mini version of a class. So, and it'll have like options to multi-class. It'll be yeah. So we're just seeing after I figured out how that is actually a working function, then pretty much Puppeteer's done. It would just need art, and then we just need to get layout done, and then all of those will be made available. Both Scourge and Puppeteer will be made available to Patreon. They will be purchasable on my Patreon store once I finalize it. But if you're a $10 patron, you will get immediate access to them for pretty much for free. Currently, right now, if you're a $5 patron, $5 and $10 patron, you have access to every species option I've released so far, which is the Blue Goblin, the Dwar, Space Penguin, and the Dragon Turtleborn. That video just went out too. And then next month we're gonna have Gnolls. We're gonna have playable Gnolls. So yeah, next month playable Gnolls, and then after that Fairy Dragonborn. I think that's the play things what we're gonna do. Yeah, yeah. But that about does it today. A little short stream. I got some stuff I gotta go run and do. I gotta go move money around and be an adult and do adult things, pay bills. So yeah, thank you guys for showing up, hanging out. I will catch you guys later. You guys have a good one. Peace.